Jose Karry from Guide Tide and Vice Outdoors, and today we're going to just do another rundown of another one of our boxes for the South Fork of the Boise. Now this can be a useful video and kind of setup for any tailwater. Any water that's below a dam is going to have a very similar attitude to what we're going to go over right now. But this is just going to be a little bit more specific to the South Fork. So we're going to start with our nymph rig, okay? Everything that we do here can be done with a 9-foot 5 weight. This happens to be a 10-foot 5 weight just because it's my personal preference, but the rigging stays the same. All that's going to be is your indicator, and there are many of them out there. This happens to be an airlock. I drop down, in this case, pretty far. We were fishing some deeper holes. I have my first fly. I prefer to tie on the bend to my second fly. Okay, and that's going to be your very basic nymph rig. You may need to add a split shot about 6 inches above that first fly and move that indicator a lot. In a perfect world, you'd want those flies to hit the bottom and then back it off just a little bit. So those flies are just hovering right above the bottom. That's going to give you the highest chance of success throwing a nymph rig. But that's going to be your basic setup. 2 flies, indicator. All right, don't be afraid to move it up and down. Okay, moving on down the line.
What size line weight and leader are you using out here?
So pretty much for everything I do, I like to use a 9-foot 4X leader. That is my favorite all-around trout leader. I can throw nymphs, I can put dries on, and it tends to do pretty well. Now, in the nymph game, I almost never go less than 4X on my leaders so that it has a little bit more backbone for that turnover. This can be the exception, and this is your dry fly rig. Again, just a 9-foot 5 weight, okay? On the leaders on these, I start with a 9-foot, typically a 5X leader. I want to get a little thinner when I go to the dry flies. And I'll add another foot or 2 of tippet material depending on where we're at. Typically, that 10-foot rig tends to be pretty good for me here on the South Fork. And this one just has a small blue wing olive dry tied onto the bottom, okay? The reason I have a blue wing olive on is during this season, winter, blue wing olives and midges tend to be the #1 bug. Start with a single fly rig, and as you feel more confident in your casting and your ability to keep tight yet open loops, you can always go with 2 and do dry dropper rigs, okay? But your very basic dry fly rig is going to be that 9-foot 5X leader, tie on 5 or 6X tippet, and your fly. That's going to get it done in most of the areas, and especially here on the South Fork. Okay, now, the next one we have is just your basic streamer rig. Now, this one's going to be a little different. With the streamer, I'm typically throwing a 7.5-foot 3X leader. I shorten it up a little bit. If you do a 9-foot leader, that's just fine. It'll just be a little longer, okay? And tie on that streamer. You can tie it directly to your leader, or you can add a foot of tippet and tie it to that. I like fluorocarbon for streamers just to help get a little bit deeper, but that's not necessary. The reason you're going to want that shorter leader is, 1, it's going to help you cast a little easier, and 2, it's going to give you a lot more control and connection as that streamer bounces along in the on the bottom, and it's going to give you a much higher chance of maximizing when you get that hit from a fish to also get a hookup. Remember, when you're throwing those streamers, keep your tips down. Don't trout set. It's just a nice sweep to the side, and that's going to get you a much higher likelihood of keeping that fish pinned once you get it. Now, with the streamers, this happens to be a 9-foot 6 weight. Typically, when you're throwing streamers, I would suggest sizing up the weight of rod, getting up to that 6, 7, and depending where you're at, even an 8 weight can be appropriate. But I find that for this river and for my personal preferences, a 6 weight tends to be one of my favorite streamer setups. Now, just for honorable mention, if you happen to be one of those 2-handed guys, which I'm kind of new to it, but I've been enjoying it, this has been my streamer setup, and I'm doing the same thing. I have my big 2-hand line, but I just put another, this is a 12-foot 6 weight. So this is a very specific style of fishing to mimic those big steelhead runs. It covers water really efficiently. Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't say this is a necessary tool, but it's a fun one to use nonetheless. And on this, I've just mirrored what I would do on my single hand rod. I put on, I actually went with a 9-foot 3X leader just because this rod is so long and it's easy to have control. And I tied my streamer directly onto that leader. You may find in faster water, you gotta get heavier flies or sink tips, but for the most part, that floating line is gonna get done what you need. So those are your 3 basic rigs that we're gonna use on most of our trout rivers, but especially here on the South Fork of the Boise. Don't forget to check out Guide Tide, look for those specific boxes or any other box that you might need. Those instructions are on the back. Come back to the video anytime you have questions. Thank you for stopping by, and tight lines, everyone.